the Lake Michigan Angler Podcast.
Push on, guys, right here.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Lake Michigan Angler Podcast. I'm Rob, and this is Michael. And today you're here with Arnie Arredondo of Phoenix Charters and Mike Smith of Coach One Charters, and also a former tackle shop guy.
Welcome, guys.
Oh, well, hey, thanks for having us.
I know we're all early morning. Today's not the most beautiful of days, so we do appreciate you guys coming out and hanging out with us for the podcast. There's a lot to talk about. I know me and Rob were discussing this particular episode, and I don't know. I think we kind of going to share with you now. The idea for this one really, in addition to covering kind of like your guys' stories, as far as fishing Lake Michigan, but also some of the story on how we've got to this point in these programs are so elaborate and intricate in these things. And you know, Rob has said that you guys have a lot of knowledge in how this all came about. So I'm excited to kind of archive some of these stories on how this all kind of came about. So as we get into that, let's go ahead and start off. Arnie, we'll start with you. Share with everyone a little bit about yourself, how long you've been fishing, and kind of just a background on yourself.
Well, I was kind of lucky that as I was growing up, Lake Michigan was kind of developing. You know, it was obviously a very new thing, the salmon fishing, as it was just starting. If you look at it then compared to now, that's what we've talked a lot about, is how it's evolved and the things that we started with, and where we're at now is ridiculously different, you know. And Mike has a great background with that, and he and I always talk. Unfortunately, we talk about the old days now. That means that we've gotten old,
The glory days.
But you know, my fishing started obviously like most did offshore. I was fortunate enough that my dad was a good sport, and not a super big fisherman, but he was always supporting as far as like my hobbies and interests. And you know, like everybody else, we got a small boat. You know, nobody had big boats when we started fishing, and just the way it's evolved with that. But always fished offshore when I could. When we could get out on the boat, we went out fishing, and then that just turns into the high school. Going to get into high school, you get older. Now I can take the boat by myself, and then. Pretty much knew I was going to do it a little bit. I wasn't one of these guys that worked as a mate or anything. I just fished. And when I was old enough to get the Coast Guard license, I went through all the testing and got the license, and pretty much bought a wooden boat, a 32, which if I had a picture of it, you guys would laugh. And
There were a lot of wood boats in those days.
That's what it mainly was.
It's crazy to hear that, because I've never seen a wood boat.
In the springtime, when they put them in, there was more sawdust in the water than there was anything, because you were trying to get them to stop leaking.
Yep.
All those things everybody forgets about didn't even know. And then just put up my shingle and went into business. And it was a plan to do it for a few years, and with school and after high school to college. And then it just evolves into I always tell people it's the hobby that got out of control on me. And now we're 30 plus years later and we're still fishing. So
Incredible. And Mike, how about yourself?
I got my captain's license in 1979. In 1976, I started working for Jeff Heinz, who was based out of Waukegan Harbor. And I worked for him as a first mate for 3 years, and then I ran his second boat. Once I got my captain's license in 1980 and 81, I ran his second boat for him. And then after that, I went into business for myself and been fishing ever since. And in 1986, my wife and I bought a tackle store that was in Winthrop Harbor here, preceding this store, and the Salmon Connection. And we had that for about 17 years. After the first year, we had a couple partners come in with us on that, and did that till about, I think it was 2003. And just, I was fortunate. My dad salmon fished. That's how I got into it. My dad was actually the first Lure Jensen rep for the Great Lakes area. So I grew up salmon fishing from the time I was in high school. But as a kid, fishing with him, we enjoyed it, but we weren't very good at it. Like a lot of people at the time. That people now don't realize how much knowledge is available to you. Oh. And in those days, the lure selection was very limited. There were no specific lures for Lake Michigan. Everything you got was West Coast equipment that you tried to adapt and use. And you don't realize how much good lures and tackle you have now, that the tackle was very limited. People ran very few rods. Most guys would run 4 or 6 rods. If you ran 8 rods, you were like the king, everything evolved over time to people running more and more rods and specialty rods for each different purpose and everything. That it's like Arnie said, it's unbelievable how it's evolved and how more complicated it's gotten compared to how simple it was when we started. There was just very limited tackle available when we started.
So, I guess let's start kind of back in the when you guys first started. What were you guys running? What was kind of like? What was the programs back then? What was the lake like? In terms of just. When you think about the clarity, I know that that's changed over the years. What was the ecosystem like? Can you guys share from those days when you first started?
Mike gave a quick, I don't know how you say it, like a synopsis of his fishing.
Because we're gonna dive into it
when it comes down to like who's been at it and who knows about the old days. Mike Smith's gonna be the oracle on that, because I'm old. He's older than I am. I'm still a baby. But he kind of went quick because, we talk about the simple lure like the J-plug. J-plug pretty much revolutionized Lake Michigan fishing at one point. It was the lure, the only lure. I mean, if you were going to catch king salmon, that was it.
What time period was this about?
This is
70s.
Yeah,
so 70s was J-plug was a thing.
70s into the 80s.
Yeah, but it's funny, when I met Mike back in the 80s, when we got to know each other and you talk about a J-plug, his dad brought the J-plug to this area.
Oh, because he's kind of
Mike's kind of being pretty shy about where his beginning was. Mike actually was beginning at the first step of a lot of this. He was there for it. Prior to that, it was a lot of the stuff that I used and we used was bass fishing.
Really?
Yeah, yes. Adapted crankbaits. And
people use MEP spinners.
Yeah,
they would troll MEP spinners, Rapalas. And in those days, you had a choice of a floating Rapala or a sinking Rapala. Not like you have now.
Yeah, it was like like one of those you could put it on the boat and break glass in an emergency, and there was a Rapala in it. There wasn't a huge tackle. You didn't have huge tackle boxes with crazy colors, and you had a perch, and you had a shiner. We were down to, you didn't have to worry about your selection. It was very limited. Mike, the funniest thing is probably the downriggers. Wouldn't you agree?
In the early days, a lot of people didn't have downriggers. They would fish with a deep 6 or a pink lady. Lord Jensen made the pink lady. The deep 6 was made by Les Davis. They were competing companies at that time. And they didn't have a directional aspect to them like a Dipsy diver does. And they pulled really hard. And the pink lady was impossible to trip. It was a terrible mechanism. The deep 6 was better, but you had to have a sturdy rod because they really pulled hard, but they would dive. You could get down 60, 70, 80 feet with them with the bigger sizes. And, people don't appreciate a Dipsy is such a marvelous design to be able to get it to angle out, to run at the angle you want, and and people put rings on them to make them dive deeper and stuff like that, and they pull so easy through the water compared to what the deep 6 and the pink lady.
Now, there's going to be a lot of people like me that in this time period were just a twinkle in my parents' eye, right? We weren't around yet. So, like, what is this pink 6? Like, could you describe it so people have an idea?
It's similar to the Dipsy diver, but it's a more
triangular
shape.
base.
Yeah,
okay.
It's straight, and it comes to a triangular in the back, and it had a weight on it on the front so it would dive.
To pull it down.
But the weight was just there. There was no adjusting the weight.
Okay.
And the front of both of them was flat. You know, square. It was actually square in the front. And Mike was talking about the Pink Lady. It had a actual cord with a ball bearing swivel on the top. And that's where you attach your line. And all you do is slide the cord, which had another ball bearing, up a rod, a fixed rod on it. You just slide it up, put it in the water. Well, when the theory was when the fish hit it, the ball bearing on the cord would slide forward, and now it'd be in line. That great idea.
It never worked. and at the end of the day, when you wanted to pull it, you'd sit there and jerk on it, trying to get it to the ring to slide, to the front so you could.
Yeah, there was
usually
no
end up just
tripping it.
cranking it all the way out. And it was like fighting a 30-pound lake trout.
Tough times.
Yeah. And then if you were lucky enough to get a big enough fish to hit it, and then have the drag set tight enough so it would actually get it in line, the minute somebody went to pump the rod, it would reset itself.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, so
Wow.
it was an unbelievable. It was, but at the time that's what we had, so we thought it was the greatest thing.
If you
we didn't know any better.
if you couldn't afford downriggers, that's what you used, or you just put a lot of weight on your line, 1 pound balls or 1.5 pound balls or whatever that, people don't realize. And people that had downriggers, they were all manual downriggers. There were no electric downriggers. Everything was a hand crank.
And 90% of the downriggers were homemade. So you saw a boat at the a lawn tramp with one of the big, the
They'd
popular
use like a
things.
bicycle wheel.
Yeah, the tricycle
for the axle.
tire.
I imagine that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they cut the rubber tire off, and there's your
Just
channel,
use
and make a pedestal to hold it, and crank one of the pedals, and stuff a screwdriver in the spoke to stop it. And it was, and the rod hold. Oh God, the rod holders. Just to go back from, you cannot imagine what you saw.
People would use PVC one time. They'd use PVC to make a rod holder, and then the first time a king hit, it would snap it off, and they'd lose their rod and reel. Then they didn't actually spend the money to buy real rod holders after that.
Yeah, or you'd see a 2x4 with a hole saw drilled.
Yeah,
They took a
holes
hole
drilled
saw
in
and
it.
drilled it, so the rod in theory was going to angle out, but really in theory it didn't work. And but everything. I mean, I remember. Luckily, my dad was quite a fabricator, so we had some stainless steel tubing. But as we got going and started running more rods, well, we weren't sure how to have them up the side. So we, like I said, he could fabricate. So we had all kinds of vice grips, and we had them clamped on the side. And that was a whole nother adventure when something big hit it, because it wasn't holding anything. Plus, again, a lot of us were using spinning reels, because that's what we had. Nobody went out and bought a dozen rods and reels. Nobody did that in the day. They had whatever they fished with, and it was quite a circus. And in those days, a lot of the rods you'd see were fiberglass, one piece. I don't think they were 7 feet. With about
Most of the time, they were 8 or 8.5. The 8.5 foot Eagle Claw was kind of the standard rod in those days with a Penn 209 reel.
Yeah, but
that was kind of the standard setup. But a lot of people improvise and use a lot worse quality tackle than that.
I mean, they sold.
They'd use giant spinning reels, loaded with 20-pound test or something, but they'd only have like 100 yards on it. And
Wow.
The king would spool them, and
and fiberglass rods. I remember, they're just solid fiberglass, like a pool cue.
Yes, and a lot of the rods were very sturdy. That there weren't any salmon-specific rods in those days. They would use like striper rods from the ocean, casting rods for stripers, things like that for rods. That everybody thought you needed this big stout rod, almost like musky rods, but eventually people figured out you need a softer tip section. You want a sturdy rod, but it needs to be a little softer in the tip,
The more
that you
give.
aren't tearing the hooks out of them.
And in this period, what was kind of like the lake ecosystem? What did it look like?
The water
how did they
was
fish?
the water was extremely green. That I remember in the mid '70s in Waukegan Harbor, if you could see 6 inches to a foot in the water, you thought the water was clear.
Wow.
And oftentimes, before zebra mussels in April in particular, when the water is particularly cold and you get the rough northeast winds stirring up the shoreline, the mud would suspend in that cold water, and you couldn't catch a fish for a week after a blow because the water was so muddy. You could fish in the mud and they couldn't see your lures at all, or you could go out in the clear water where there was so cold there were no fish. That was your choice: fish in the mud where they couldn't see it, and a lot of times you'd fish for 4 days straight and be lucky to scratch up a few fish. And as soon as the water cleared, you'd start to have good fishing because there were a lot of fish in those days. They stocked a lot of fish. And then you get another blow, and then it would stink for another 4 or 5 days. That the spring fishing was kind of frustrating. Once zebra mussels came in, literally the same day as a blow or the next day, you can go out and catch fish because the water gets cleared up enough by the zebra mussels to where that's really not a problem anymore. But in the old days, that was a real issue we faced every day in the spring. Is if the water was muddy, they couldn't see your lures.
What was the sentiment back then when the zebra mussel started to be a thing? People were more aware that, hey, this is changing the water. What was that time period like?
You know what? When it showed up, we really didn't know what it was.
Gotcha.
We didn't know it was a progression that just slowly crept on us. But the zebra mussel hasn't been here that long. I mean, compared to what we're talking about, the early, the 70s and 80s, when we talk about it being green, that downrigger cable looked like it was cutting, like pudding or something. You could actually see it separating the particulate, everything that was in the water. I think obviously the clear water, they can see better.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big evolutions. One of the reasons that since the onset of the clear water, we have these unbelievable variety of colors and lure shapes, and we're figuring out, hey, why does this work? Why does that not work? It's like a J plug again. I bring back the J plug. You can catch some fish on it. Is it the go-to? Not really. A lot of times, and it seems like in the fall they like it, but the rest of the year you'll catch a few fish, but nothing like you on the what we now have, everyday modern day tackle that you see in the store. So it has changed a lot. That J plug had enough noise and vibration and rattled, and that's what they could find. It seemed like, I would say that the majority of people, if you took the whole, wouldn't you say, Mike, were more spoon plug, like J plug fishermen than they were flasher flies? The flasher fly guys were lake trout guys. In
the early days, it was way more plugs and spoons. Flasher and fly was a thing around here where we targeted cohos. That there was kind of two distinct types of fishermen in those days. That in the southern basin here, we targeted cohos most of the year. Farther north, they mostly targeted lake trout. So they fished differently. They were wire lining with 1 pound balls, dragging the bottom with their downriggers and such, and targeting lake trout. In those days, around here, to catch all the lake trout you wanted, all you needed was a rattle spoon behind a Dodger, dragging the bottom. And out on the hill, we used to just load up on lake trout all day, every day through the June, July, August. If the water was cold enough for the fish to be there. Things like spinning glows came along later, and flies. In the early days, another thing people don't think about, in the early days, flies were just made out of bucktail. And then synthetic fibers came along, and they made flies out of synthetic. And then tinsel came along. And then tinsel really opened things up to where then you got all kinds of color combinations and everything. But in the old days, everything was just dyed bucktail. Was common in the early days, and people don't realize all the wild colors and the mirage colors and stuff that you have now that looks so good. We didn't have any of that kind of stuff available in those days.
It was, so Mike, let's go back to early 80s. Well, let's go back to the late 70s. A spring setup for coho fishing for a private fisherman probably looked like a couple of tad polys.
Tad polys were big. Jointed Rapala. that resembled smelt.
The bomber.
Worked good. Bomber.
One that ran backwards, looked like a crayfish.
The regular bomber. The regular bomber in a kind of a green with a chartreuse was a fantastic color. But if you went too fast, it would rotate in the water instead of just wiggling like it's supposed to. Guys would run this 250 spoon plug, the 200 or 250, the little spoon plug in a green with black dots. That was a good one for cohos.
One of my favorites was a Cisco kit, in the shad color that had the metal bill, so you could kind of figure out how to make it run when you were going a little too fast. And nobody had speed indicators. We didn't have it. No one knew what a speed indicator was. You put it in the water and took a look at it.
If the water was cold, you went slow, and if it was warmer, you went faster.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of boats wouldn't go slow enough. They just fished with however they could because their boat wouldn't troll slow enough. They'd drag buckets or whatever they had to slow down.
Yeah. I remember seeing the first sea anchor. That was pretty funny. No one knew what it was, and one of the boats had it, and you're like, what? You couldn't figure out what he was dragging around. Why is he doing it? And
trying to catch fish with a net.
Yeah. And then it's pretty embarrassing to think that one guy was smart enough to figure out he needed to slow down. But, now I don't think anybody, I would bet that you go to 100 boats off the ramp and not one person has a Tad Poly.
No.
And that would have been, that was your main, that was it. That was the go-to in the spring.
Orange with black dot, poly was gold standard.
Yeah, that was the big one. That was one of the first trolling lures I remember buying.
Although in Waukegan, Bill Staben made a little green squid that was very popular behind a small red Jensen Dodger. That you got to remember the selection of flies was extremely limited at that time, and the green one worked good if it was clear weather, and if it was cloudy and overcast and dark, sunrise, sunset, then they had a kind of a medium dark blue. But, you could pretty much catch fish every day on one or the other as a fly and dodger combination. But like Arnie said, most people ran plugs and crankbaits type thing.
And something that you didn't have to have the speed even close.
Well, they work at any speed. They'd work at a faster speed.
And like Mike was saying, squids were enormous. That was a big thing with squids. Gold Star squids were, once Gold Star got to the market, then that's what, you wouldn't see a shelf full of flies. You'd see more squids than flies a lot of times for the cohos. So
yeah, it's funny because we talked about that. We got a selection of squids on the wall, and talked to Robin, like, at what period did they stop using them and it became just flies? That because they work. And I know on the West Coast they still use the little.
I would say
Hoochies, right? Is what they call it.
When tinsel flies came along, the variety of colors available in tinsel are enormous, and they pretty much took over the market that the squids had. That the squids came in a lot of variety of colors, and if I had to blame one person, I'd blame Howard. The Howie fly is probably what killed squids.
Yeah. Good job, Howard. Nice, Howard. The funny thing is you can see like the people that use squids. What would they call them? Senior citizens. You see,
a lot of the old guys continue to use squids.
You see that only pretty much guys that have been around or fished a long time ago. I'm sure the clear water helped kill the squid. Along with, because the tinsel was, crazy difference. It was, we had a lot of hair flies. Like Mike was saying, he was a great innovator for Lake Michigan in this area. In the Kenosha area was a guy named Joe Duffin. Yeah. And Joe Duffin tied flies. He was one of these guys that, he was going to make the wheel better. He couldn't help it. And Joe was the first one. I mean, he just, like a mad scientist a little bit, and much like Howie, a mad scientist, just kept tying different things. And a lot of them, were definitely alewife based. A lot of them are great lake trout flies. The one thing that was interesting is that one of the best lake trout flies is actually a perch. Looked like a perch, which, we really don't think of now, but it was green and yellow and white. And it was, it looked more like a perch than it did anything else.
And I think those colors just showed up better in the greener water, because it's fairly darker pattern. It just silhouetted well in the water that had more color to it.
So let me ask you at this point, you've got some of these innovators, these fishing mad scientists, as you guys referred to, which is great. They're coming up with flies. And at this point, you're saying J plugs were a thing. There were some other lures early on that were kind of like the go-to. I'm assuming that some of this early stuff, how much of it was adapted from the West Coast salmon guys? Was a small selection of it that early on guys here were using for the salmon here?
In the 70s, everything that we used was adapted from the West Coast. But in the 80s, you started to get, like Arnie said, you had people around here that were trying to come up with better ways to do things and better ways to fish. And guys like Joe Duffin, he made a smelt pattern fly that was excellent. That looked very much like an alewife. You started to get people around here starting to try and make a better wheel.
Right. But, how do they convince you guys or the fishermen at large to, hey, take this fly that I made and shove it in the water and because I know, and I think we all know that as fishermen, we get in our ways. We like our certain lures and setups to the point where I'm sure, Arnie, there's a certain rod that you don't take off the flasher fly. It's always on that one rod, and we get really hard into what we're using. So how did that process go where guys actually went out on the limb and said, all right, I'm going to throw it on. I'm going to try a fly, A
lot of people that made early products of any kind would go around to the harbors and just hand stuff out. They just give people samples and hand them out. I remember Howard coming to Jeff in Waukegan, and when his first fly that made him famous was just a white with a little bit of pearl in it, and before they had a million other colors. And I remember it was I want to say July maybe. We were there was cold water down deep, but surface was warm. And Howie was out on his 17-foot Starcraft by himself and just pounded. He had a cooler that's just full of fish. And he came in and he showed Jeff the white fly that he was using. And Jeff made some comment like, well, people either want the green or the blue, Staben squid that you might have caught a bunch of fish today on it, but that's no big deal. Well, it turned out to be a big deal.
Yeah. I remember the first, the Mike talking about that. I got my first white Howie. There used to, where Prairie Cove is now, used to be a marina called Trident. And that, then we're going to fast forward a few years. Mm-hmm. And Howie gave Dan Keating a few white ones. And those were the first ones Keating ever got. And Keating gave me a couple. And it was one of those things where you could not believe that it would outfish your standard go-to everyday moneymaker until you put it in the water. And it was literally one of those things. Everybody's searching for the silver bullet. At that time, that white Howie was the silver bullet. That was an incredible fly. Problem is, it can't take
too much.
It takes a beating. Yeah. So now you're down to the piece of plastic and
a few tinsels.
Yeah, and now I'm begging to get I
was just about to get to that part. I can imagine the guys knocking on Howie's door to get some.
And it was funny at that time. Howie wasn't like giving them away like you think. He wasn't in full production. So it was like. He was
a one-man operation, so the quantity was limited.
Yeah, you did whatever it took to get one from him. I remember having 3 at one time and just being ridiculously excited that I had 3, but I would only run one at a time. Yeah, because I didn't want to
stretch it out. You want to stretch it out?
Yeah, it was.
What was the setup? You were running that. At that time,
what were you, Silver Dodger with a white Howie
behind a Chrome Jensen Dodger,
lake trout, coho, you catch everything on it.
Yeah, it was.
It just looks like an alewife in the water,
and it must have been the right time for the clarity and
like the water.
Man, water was gradually clearing up.
It was ridiculous how good
it was. Still before zebra mussels, but through pollution standards and laws, the water was getting cleaner. They'd taken the phosphates out of laundry soap and stuff to where there's less runoff from yards and such, to where the water was getting gradually clearer, to where you could see 3 feet in the water.
Yeah, big day
instead of 6 inches.
Yeah, and it's funny because we talk about clear water. I'd say probably into the early 90s. it was a rarity that we ever fished outside of 130.
Yeah,
that was a
wow.
big deal. Like
Okay.
you were nuts if
Okay.
you went outside of 130. I was like, why? And because at the end, the hill, our drop off just concentrated so many fish. A lot of lake trout, but it seemed like in those days the lake trout being there brought other fish in. Where now the hill, it's like it's such a perfect thing, but it just doesn't. It doesn't have the draw it did. It's still got current, still got bait. The fish don't seem to like it and it's probably a lot with the clarity.
I was just thinking of it.
they don't like the
Darker
bottom.
water might give them a little more protection, so they can get in a little closer. Than
In the early days, we spent a lot of time fishing anywhere from 10 to 60 feet of water.
God, I wish it was like that.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in the kayak, there's so much.
If the water was cold by shore, the fish were there. Period. You didn't have to go anywhere else.
It was
now. Even when the water's cold by shore, you still do better on the hill and beyond.
Yeah, it was funny, when shore fishing growing up, all it had to do was blow for a couple of days out of the west. And we weren't smart enough to figure out that, hey, if it blows southeast for one day and it blows west for half a day, water's cold. We just didn't know yet. And I'm going back when I was in, before even high school, and you knew the water was cold. You went down shore fishing, and those fish were there. They were not afraid of the shore. And I grew up pretty close to like the Carthage College area, so we'd fish there. Obviously, once I got older, the piers were the place to be. And I'll really age myself because you couldn't get on the South Pier. You had to walk the rocks all the way around. Now, not the way they look now, but it was pretty long walk. For me, luckily, my dad, like I said, my dad was he was an industrial arts teacher at the high school. So he knew everybody. And luckily, he knew some of the guards at American Motors that guarded the gate there. So I used to get to ride my bike to the South Pier. There'd be 40 people on the North Pier fighting for the corner. And myself and one of my buddies would have the South Pier to ourselves.
Wow.
Yeah, those were the...
Hooked up constantly with fish, probably.
It was ridiculous. A lot of guys that fish, they love to hear, a couple guys, they love to hear about that alewife bite. We'd catch alewives, and then, that was our bait. And a lot of days, and I want to say the good old days, because those fish concentrated so well, as that sun came up, in those days, you could only fish with 2 rods. You'd take one out of the water because you couldn't keep up with 2 rods. You'd lose it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you'd throw it in, just a standard alewife setup that you're going to soak on the bottom with an egg sinker, on a length, 3 feet of line, and then the alewife wouldn't make it to the bottom. A fish would grab it on the way down. I mean, it was just how well they concentrated. The water being a little bit, obviously a lot different.
Yeah.
They weren't afraid of anything. They couldn't see. I don't think they could see anything.
Right.
They would come in shallow because the light penetration wasn't a problem. It wouldn't deter them.
A little concealment, right?
Yeah.
You could catch fish all day long.
And everybody that didn't fish Lake Michigan, was an inland lake fisherman. And a bass, at the end of those days, if you caught a bass, they kept it. That was just the way it was.
Right.
And you go from catching a few 1.5, 2 pound bass to catching, 8, 9 pound coals. Cause we had fewer kings, a lot of coals.
Mm.
I mean, it was just like, I'm done with that. I'm never going off, I'm stuck to this lake, and, that was your first drug that you took, was that first time you got every bit of line pulled off by a king. You're like, holy smokes. I remember seeing the first king. Smith, can you remember when you saw the first king?
Yeah. We actually caught one as a kid off Port Washington.
Oh yeah, you told me that.
24 pounder.
I was riding a bicycle and the talk was there was a Chinook caught. That was the talk. Not 10 of them. A Chinook was caught. And at the time, Captain Jim's in Kenosha was a tackle shop, and they had it in their cooler. And I remember riding down on my bike, which was this long trip at that time, about 2.5 miles, to see the Chinook sitting in the freezer. And it was only about 6 pounds, but it was a Chinook. I knew it wasn't anything you caught. And, you're sitting there thinking, I'm going to get one day, and now it's like, how many are you going to catch some days? Now it's just the first one was a big deal. And that Chinook we had people like to do it, but once those Chinooks showed up, the lake blew up. That was when Lake Michigan got the star. We were put on the map. You know, that was huge, huge.
But one thing you have to remember is the cohos were a lot bigger in those days too, so they were more exciting to catch. That when I first started in 1980 chartering, an average size coho was 12 or 14 pounds.
Oh, wow.
And the biggest I had that year, I think, was like a 16 pounder, 16 and a half, somewhere in there. But the regular cohos were 12 to 14, and for a lot of years after that, you know, even years when they weren't quite as big, they still be 10, 12 pounds for a lot of years. And then once we got into the 80s, then as alewives declined, they gradually got smaller. And other than, I don't know, quite a few years ago, we had that one freak year where they were all 12,
99,
14
I think.
pounds. Yeah. We had a freak year that.
The year of the giant coho.
Yeah, where it happened again. But the year 99, that's what the cohos were like. Those were regular cohos when I started.
Wow.
Because there was so much food in the lake.
Yeah.
The lake was just wall-to-wall alewives. They
It's
just
funny.
had to swim with their mouth open.
I was sitting there thinking while Mike was talking about a story that Mike told me. You know, we talk about how we fly, we talk about Joe Duffin, these early things. There used to be a spoon, and the spoon, when it showed up, there was a couple, and Mike was one of the guys that had one, and it was a Norwegian.
Storlaxon,
Yeah.
Norwegian spoon is what people just called it.
And Mike, you got to tell us a story about how you guys got that.
Well, originally, a guy who was a Norwegian was visiting the homeland, and he bought some of these spoons thinking they would work for salmon, and they were designed for salmon. Storlaxon in Norwegian, from what I was told, means big salmon. And he chartered my boss, Jeff Heinz, on his boat, and he went out in May, and he wanted to try these spoons. And Jeff was kind of not real agreeable.
That's a nice way of putting it, Mike.
Jeff was a colorful character, and he wasn't real agreeable. But the guy said, "If you don't let me run three of these spoons, I'm not going to go. You know, I'm not going to take the charters." So Jeff's like, "Okay." He really didn't want to have 3 dead rods out there, so he put 3 of them out. And in those days, we only ran like 10 or 12 lines. You know, we didn't run the huge spreads that we do now. And it was in May, and they actually caught quite a few fish on them. But as we got into June, when the kings started to show up, Jeff was absolutely pounding the kings on this spoon in the summertime when nobody else was catching kings. And it was just the right size, and it was the right shape to resemble an alewife, and it was silver plated. In those days, a lot of lures were not silver plated. And he had 3 of them, and then the guy started importing them and selling them, but that took like a year or 2 before they actually hit the market. But the rest of that summer, Jeff was fishing, I want to say it was early August. He was fishing up by the nuke plant, pounding the kings, and he had a king run him out of line and break off. And the next day I was trolling on running his other boat, and we're trolling along, and all of a sudden, you know, I yell fish on because the yellowbird's dragging back, and pretty soon, you know, we're getting it just didn't seem right. Well, we had hooked the line, and Jeff was running this triple fish line that was kind of a camel colored. It was kind of a brownish, grayish color that nobody else ran because it was a real strong, durable line. And as soon as I saw that line, I'm like, "Oh, wait till you see what's on the end of this," because I knew there was a king on there. We pulled in like a 22, 23 pound king that was half dead. It was still alive, but I pulled in and I said, "Wait till you see this." You know, we'd fished for like 3 hours and hadn't had a bite. We snagged this line, pulled in the lure. I go, "Oh, wait till you see what this does." I put it down. We caught 6 more kings in the last 2 hours on that lure. Just pounded them. And then I called Jeff on the radio. I'm like, "Hey, guess what I found?" He goes, "What?" I said, "We just caught a line in the water, kind of brown line with a spoon on it." Jeff's like, "I'll give you $100 for that." I'm like, "Nope," and I'm going to hide it so you can't find it. Because I know he'd climb on the boat and steal it back from me.
I was thinking about that part. Like, would you tell them that you have it or not? That's actually pretty funny.
But, you know, like Mike said, it was silver plated. Maybe that was it, you know.
It was the right size. It had a good action. You know, now it's about the size that all the salmon spoons that you see now in a million different colors are. But in those days, just being silver plated was enough, you know, that it had more shine, and a lot of the lures were just chrome or nickel plated, and the silver reflected better.
So to kind of piece together a loose timeline here, when we're talking about the fly period, when it started, this is roughly what time period? In
Probably mid-'80s.
So about the mid-'80s?
Yeah, that it started to really take shape.
And then you mentioned the spoons now. So now we're getting into the spoon side of things. This is roughly the same time period?
Yeah, I would say.
So they were kind of coinciding. Is this the 80s period, like really the, I don't know,
That's
fishing enlightenment period?
Yes,
Is
okay. That's like the growth period of the Great Lakes salmon fishing.
Got it.
You know, people locally started producing products, and I would say Gold Star had their Kingfisher spoon, came out with a bunch of wild color. At the time we thought was a bunch of wild colors, and they were probably the first salmon-sized spoon, you know, with the silver plated, and then they had the really bright colors on them, wild color patterns, and pretty much after that, everybody started copying those, and then you have all the spoons that you have now.
Prior to that, you know, there was a big period where, like the North Point Nailer, you know, that was white on one side and then black or green, but not great variations, and then the tape was a little different, and it wasn't tape on the complete spoon, it was just
A diagonal
scallop tape.
Yeah. And it was, you know, and I think, Mike, even more of that was, at that time, was those lighter Flutter Spoons type.
There always were Sutton spoons and Flutter spoons. The Flutter spoon was Lure Jensen's version of a Sutton spoon. That they were silver plated. They were super thin. The fish would quickly destroy them, just crumple them. Sometimes you could bend them back and they'd still work. Sometimes they'd never work again after they got crumpled.
Yeah, there's a spoon that, Rob, you'd need the Sutton spoon display that they used to send, and they'd have all their spoons on a board, you know, and that's how you'd pick them. And then when you bought them, they came in a little box, and there was like tissue paper,
like silver, like it protects the silver finish.
Yeah. So I mean, it literally was like you were buying a piece of jewelry, you know, and then you held it like it was jewelry, you know, because it was expensive, and
it was.
You at the time to spend any money on that it wasn't, you know, people didn't do it, you know. And some of this, Mike, come on, think of some. You know, I always think of the Charger, one of my favorites, the Charger spoon. People don't even know what it looks like. You know, Dave Scott and I always love to do that, go back and talk about, you know, like one of my favorite casting spoons was a Loco, you know, and they're still around. They've still hung on somehow. I don't even know the crazy, you know, some of the old time crazy spoons that were out there, you know, you know, being in an industrial area, guys knew how to make dyes. So they were making dyes and stamping spoons, and it was pretty cool though to see, you know, the guys that were trying to innovate something.
One other thing I'd like to bring up is in the mid '80s, also the jointed rebels were popular. Dan Keating popularized them. That he would troll for kings.
The fast tracks?
Fast tracks and just regular rebels, both in the medium to larger sizes. But he would troll and catch a lot of kings on them on days when they wouldn't bite other things.
Mike, when did your dad brought the Yellowbird to popularity, right?
Yeah.
When was that? What year?
In the mid '70s.
Yeah.
That I remember him giving Jeff, you know, a couple of them to try.
Yeah.
And immediately, you know, we ran them, and we're catching more fish than we were on just downriggers and flatlines, which is what people had. That by having one line off to the side on either side, we were catching probably 3 or 4 fish to one compared to.
You know, the funny
rods.
thing about the Yellowbird was...
And it didn't take long before we were running 3 aside.
The Yellowbird was kind of like, when you first got it, it was a little bit like the Pink Lady. You know, the way they had it originally set up.
The original ones were made out of wood.
Yeah.
And then they went to the foam.
But they were made to be in line, not slide down the line.
Right. The idea of having them release came later.
Yeah.
People innovated
so more
and made
hard
them
lines.
release.
So the where you put
tied
the
them in
release...
line.
Yeah, where the release goes down was where you attached the line going to the rod, and then the back part you just tie a leader length, and then your lure went behind it.
Right.
Oh, wow.
That's how it was originally designed.
Imagine the disasters that came from that. You know.
Yeah.
I remember having them. And, you know, of course, you know, got one. So we only had one, but I can't remember what side of the boat it went on. and look at the diagram on the back, and why wouldn't you believe them? This is the way you do it, right? They just didn't tell you that you had to, like, the leader length was kind of critical, because now you have a yellowbird all the way up to the rod on an 18-foot boat and a 20-foot leader.
Just handline it.
Yeah, and those, and of course you had a kicker motor, which really wasn't in the right spot, and everything was wrong in those days. Really, I mean, it's so refined now that then now you're trying to hand line this fish, and it was the first yellowbird that did not go smoothly.
It was a rodeo of sorts.
I was like, okay, now what? The fish is 20 yards or 20 feet away, and it's still a little green running wherever it wants, and you're trying to net it, or do something. It always, in those days, I don't even want to think of how many I ended up in the motor. It's like, I got the motor again.
Yeah. Now, in this period as well, so many things are kind of developing, being refined and innovated on. When we look at flashes and dodgers, you go out here and you look at the wall, there's just a plethora of designs, styles, colors. Were the flashers in this time period starting to be a thing, or did this not come to the picture at that point?
In the early days, everybody just ran the 00 red or orange Jensen Dodger. That was the standard with any fly or squid.
And then
if you were fishing kings or lake trout, you ran the bigger, silver one with the silver prism. And that was pretty much all you needed to catch fish on any given day. And, people started trying different colors, and they came out with a lot of different colors after that.
Mike, when did the smoke Jensen come out? That was when you had the store.
That was probably in the 90s.
Yeah, I remember getting that. I remember getting a smoke Dodger from Mike. Mike, hey, come here and grab this. Try to give this a try. And you're like, all right, Mike, how many do you have?
Well,
like, wow, does this work?
It worked good.
Yeah.
It worked good. And the smoke is just a silver plating, and then they tumble it to rough it up, that it's a flat finish instead of a shiny finish, but it's just silver plated.
And that was, that was cutting edge. That was
it still works.
Yeah,
that was a big deal. The smoke Dodger, when it hit, that was a big deal, because now you just didn't have silver, get a smoke,
right?
Which was technically silver.
Yeah,
it was a dull silver instead of shiny.
Yeah.
But again, at that time, the water was getting clear. By then, there were zebra mussels and a more subtle silver finish. Probably on some days, bright sun and such would work better than a shinier flash.
Yeah,
that
too much flash.
Started to be nuances to what you were using.
When did everybody start using things that glow in the dark?
Oof.
The first J plugs actually had glow in the dark belly paint on them that was taken off the market because it had emitted too much radiation. The early J plugs in the 70s,
fish would die before they bite
the glow in the dark belly would glow a bluish color. And then they had to quit using that paint because it was too radioactive. We didn't know about this stuff in those days. And they went to the paint that was more of a greenish glow that I still like what they use now, where it glows greenish, kind of a greenish yellow instead of deep blue. But the original paint was kind of a bluish glow.
The only glow in the dark spoon you could get was a crocodile.
Mm-hmm.
That was the only one you ever saw with any glow.
Yeah. And those worked fantastic, that people would throw them in the fall for the kings.
Yeah.
My dad would actually troll them on a yellowbird, and he'd catch a lot of fish on them that way.
Do you recall when everything started to have glow this, glow spoons, glow, glow everything? Do you remember when that really started to be a thing?
Probably late 80s.
So, okay. So
I think as the water got clearer, it started to work better under low light. When the water was clear, fish could see it from a greater distance.
Mm-hmm.
So it started to become
the glow
a factor.
tape, got popular once the plastics had hit. Once we started having plastic flashers, rotators. Actually, flashers were the first ones, and a lot of people fought them. It was like, oh, come on, really, plastic? And what's funny is like a hotspot. The hotspot was the first one we really had around here, and it was the crushed glow on one side and then what we call the lead on the other. Well, we all thought the lead looked bad, so we all peeled it off. And then, like later on, you learn, like, hey, wait a minute, I think that's exactly what they're looking at.
Well, it's a dull flash instead of a bright flash,
yeah, so it's
which some days is what they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that foil just didn't look right because we're used to prism or silver, and it took a little bit. I think Hotspot obviously changed that market, getting that. And that's a West Coast, it's a British Columbia thing, I think, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And-
And he came out with tapes and colors.
Well, part of that, when I had my store, I remember the guy coming in trying to get us to buy the Hotspot Dodgers, and I looked at them, and I tried a couple, and I didn't catch anything. But that was in the mid-'80s when there were no kings around. They were dying of the BKD disease. So we virtually, for 4 or 5 years, wouldn't hardly catch a king. And that's what they really excel at, is catching kings. And we were catching lots of cohos on the regular Jensen Dodgers and the metal ones. And, I didn't give them a fair try because I didn't know how to use them correctly. I wasn't using long enough leaders. I was running short leaders like we did with our regular Dodgers and stuff. And I tried them a couple times, and it's a dead rod. You can't have a dead rod out there. You put the stuff that's working on it, and just kind of blew them off. And then about 4 years later, they started working because we started to have kings show up. Probably about the time when they started spawning naturally on their own in some of the streams in Michigan. And DNR didn't know we started catching more and more kings, and they weren't stocking more kings. They were stocking less kings, but we started catching more of them. And once we started catching kings, the plastic Dodgers really took off.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now we've talked about some of the lures and all the stuff. I want to shift it and start talking about the actual setups and specifically, let's get into wire and coppers and all the stuff. And from your guys' experience, when was your first kind of recollection of someone telling you or you discovering that, hey, guys are putting wire line into the water and fishing it and copper lines, because that to me is so interesting. How did we get from, fishing lines to this stuff? It's really advanced stuff. It's,
the wires we always used when we lake trout fished.
Okay.
So that was always there. The first time it was used on a diver was really that was
game changer.
That was a game changer because I don't know why they, kings especially will seek out that diver on that wire. And yeah, you'll catch fish on Power Pro or mono divers, but nothing like that wire. And I'll tell you, the first person I know that was telling me about it, like convincing me to try it, was Dale Floric.
Yeah.
Dale was always kind of messing with stuff too. And he kept telling me about it. And then finally I'm like, all right, I'm going to give it a try. Absolutely believing that the way I did it was perfect and no, everybody else was wrong. That's how fishermen are. Our egos make us a little bit funny. And man, that was an eye opener. That was a big eye opener. That I would say that running wire divers was a huge step, and nobody realized it at the time. But it's turned out to be, so obvious.
Is this still in the 80s or are we
no,
moving down?
We're in the
80s, probably early 90s.
Yeah, somewhere in the 90s.
So now we've got that transition where the water's slowly getting better, less polluted, starting to clear up.
Yep.
Right. So could that have been a factor in why that might have taken off? It seems like there's not a lot of.
For one thing, in those days, the Dipsy diver didn't have a ring, or they didn't make bigger diameter ones. The Dipsy would only get down 50 feet or so, and then it would run out of steam. It would just get farther back and not really much deeper. But once you put it on a wire, there was no limit to how deep you could go with it. The wire, because it was heavy and fine diameter, would make it sink, and you could fish 90, 100 feet down with a wire Dipsy that you couldn't do with mono. And that was kind of at the starting point of the Power Pro and synthetic lines that those developed about that time too. Mm-hmm. But like Arnie says, the wire was heavy, so it helped the Dipsy sink compared to the Power Pro or something. It would run deeper, but it wouldn't go down like wire does.
And wire must give off, there must be something to the harmonic of it, or
vibration in the water.
Mm-hmm. There's something, it draws them. Back then, I say back then, like, late 80s, a lot of people were like, just like 1-2 divers, one diver aside, that'd be about it. One summer came, springtime's a little different. And it was funny, there was a few of us that ran lighter line on our divers. And everybody would be like, would ask you, well, that can't make a difference. What difference does it make? The lure's still the same behind the diver, but what they were missing was the diameter of the line to the diver was getting us down further.
Yeah.
And then you help, information in those days wasn't shared anything like it is now.
Right.
Then you were like, yeah, and I'm glad you think that because that you've missed the whole point of this. And you just kind of quietly get back on your boat and go by your way. Like Mike was saying, this, everybody wants to think that 100% the water change was zebra mussels. It was changing prior to them showing up. It was slow, but it was definitely changing. It wasn't, the pea soup that we had to start.
Right.
It was, everybody wants to say, oh, the lake's so clean, is only clear because of the zebra mussel. Well, 60 years or 50 years of EPA regulation and, the PCB level being stopped from whatever, all the different industries and everything being right. That's all. And they knew it. It was going to take a while. What do they say? It takes 50 years for history. So, it took 50 years and now we're here where we're at, I think I'm a big believer that's one of the reasons these alewives keep coming, have a bad year, but then they can rebound a little bit. And it's not all, zebra quagga mussel based. It can't be, they keep coming back. They're eating something, they're staying alive. So that was, that plays into all of it. Copper, I'll tell you how, believe it or not, copper is not that old. Copper is a 2000s thing. And the first time I ever saw copper, I was with Chip Porter, and we were in New York. And a guy named Ernie Lantane had it, wrote an article about it. No one knew about it. And we met him, and he showed us the copper line.
So he's not from the area or Lake Michigan. He's
Lake Ontario.
So Great Lakes angler from okay.
Yeah. And he just, apparently it was something that they had used, like his father used at one time. Like lead core. Lead core was real popular, then it disappeared for a long time. And then it slowly started coming back.
In the 60s, people on Lake Superior would use things like lead core when they didn't have downriggers, and they'd use wire lines with a 1 pound ball attached that when they didn't have downriggers, that there was always stainless steel wire, with 1 pound balls that people used instead of a downrigger. If they didn't have downriggers, that was how they fished down deep.
On Superior, I don't know if you've ever seen those old lake trout reels. They're big wooden reels, like 12-inch diameter.
They're like
reels.
a downrigger.
Yeah.
They're like a downrigger.
And they use, instead of the 7-strand, they use single strand wire with a small sash
Monell
weight for a window
wire.
weight. And everybody thinks, oh, we innovated all this. They use cut bait. By the way, they used a piece of sucker was behind cowbells was how you caught lake trout on Lake Superior from whenever the first guy went out, and that was the way to do it, And, we did wire, we did different wire, and, evolution.
Lead core made a comeback once the water was clear after zebra mussels, that it was a way to get lures way away from the boat is why it was, it was effective because it was away from the boat. And then we also had planer boards that would pull it. In the early days, Yellowbird wasn't strong enough to pull a lead core, but as bigger boards with stronger pull became available, it was a viable option to run them lead cores off boards.
Believe it or not, that the comeback of lead core is probably more walleye based.
Yeah, the walleye guys were trolling them.
Yeah, and then that's why the bigger boards, the church board, the offshore, that size, lead core can be a challenge. Like anything else, if you're not paying attention, you can end up winding that whole mess up. So.
I want to circle back though, because you mentioned the guy you went out to the New York trip, and I want to make sure we get that story, because this is when you said you first recalled the copper. You were in New York. Can you pick back up from there?
Yeah, I was with Chip Porter. It was me, Chip, Dan Keating, and Fuzzy.
Fuzzy Bear.
Fuzzy Bear. You wouldn't know his real name if I said it anyway. It's just Fuzzy. But we were out there doing, at that time, a school that Chip Porter had put together, a series of seminars. And at the time, Chip was with Great Lakes Angler magazine. And Ernie Lantane was one of the writers. on that staff, and they knew each other. And he'd just written this article about this copper line. And that was like, we were just in the like few years on this side, like we're just getting into that like 3-4 lead cores aside. And, you know, like Fuzzy, he'd been running 4 or 5 of them now for several years. You know, and the necessity is the mother of invention. Where, you know, he's in the bottom end of the lake. A lot of times, you know, in Michigan City, he had to put a big spread out and just troll to find the band that they were in, not a structure, because the water, you know, it's so shallow.
Yeah.
And he'd written this article, and we were talking about it. And Chip said, I'm gonna get some of this copper so we can look at it. And at first, you saw it, and I'm like, huh. But Fuzzy was really like, he liked the way he was well into that. And it literally took not even a year. And Tim DeWittiak was the one who actually started working on putting together spools. And that was, you know, how the copper line showed up here. It's funny, a lot of people like to take credit for that around this lake, but it was truly Ernie Lantain from Lake Ontario. And because of his affiliation with Chip Porter, you know, I'm not going to give Chip too much credit. I can't do that.
He'll get a big
I'm
head.
taking it. I hope you're listening, Chip. I'm taking the credit now. But on that was where, you know, and Chip was even like, this could be a game changer. But I think Chip said that about everything, you know. He wanted to take credit for all the game changing. No. But he did. He recognized it more than myself and Keating did. Fuzzy and Chip were like, there's something to this. And then DeWittiak started spooling it up, and then it was available, and you just had the guts to try it, you know. And
How bad did you mess up those first couple of runs?
oh my God.
Because, man,
There's a learning curve.
expensive learning curve, right?
Expensive learning curve.
Bird nest like you've never had in your life, because you didn't know you had to be let out that way, and no one told you, because
Right. Well, because the technique was
nobody knew.
you guys were at the forefront of it, right?
Yeah,
Screwing it up.
The best thing was trying to tie a knot.
Yeah.
Oh,
Tie
yeah.
40 knots to get one that almost held. You know, and it's like, this isn't working, because Mono wants to cut it all the time. And, you know, everything else, the learning curve.
Were you guys automatically throwing them on planers, or were you running on shoot? How were you guys running it that early?
Yeah, well, when it first started, it was more like, for me, the slow developing. I didn't have the experience with that lead core like Fuzzy did or something. And so I was more off the back of the boat, which was at that time the worst place to have it, because it tangled everything.
Every fish got up in it.
You didn't know how it laid in the water yet. You know, it was all new.
Yeah.
But where it really showed itself was on tough days, and calm days, and that, you know, now we got clear water, and all of a sudden, why is this thing getting hit so much? Well, simple. It's away from the boat. You know, they're in a negative pattern. That's perfect for it. They took a look at what the boat had to offer. They didn't like it. All of a sudden, here, this is all by itself. You know, last opportunity, time to eat. You know, but it took a while for me to figure out anything. And then, luckily, like Fuzzy was kind of messing with it a lot more, so I was picking his brain on how to untangle my mess. You know, I told him, I made a joke one time. I said, I'm gonna have one of these tangles that I get. I'm just going to cut it all, put it in a box, and mail it to you. This is your fault.
What were the go-to baits that you guys were throwing on early on with the copper stuff?
I was a big spoon guy, because I was afraid of the flasher fly on it. You know, I don't know how many people at first ran flasher flies. You know what? I would say a lot of this takes like a private boater. A guy that's just hardcore fisherman, and say, hey, I ran this. And you're thinking, why would you do that? Well, what difference does it make? He did it and it worked, and then we better try it. You know, we always want to take the credit that we do everything. Well, we learn a lot from the guys that are private, because they're willing
to try it out.
And waste time.
There's no pressure. There's no pressure.
They can afford to not catch any fish.
Yeah.
You know, they're not under the gun to produce fish so they're willing to try things.
Right.
And they're the ones. A lot of the guys that are just, you know, hardcore, love to fish the lake, they're the ones that innovate some of this stuff, or more of it than you think, really. We just get the opportunity to run it more and refine it, and then we look like, you know, of course we want to take the credit then, you know.
Yeah. What was that? Was it 200 copper, 300 copper back then? What was kind of like the starting point where it most people were running when it first kind of was being introduced?
You know what? I would say that the 2 and the 3,
kinda,
the 2 more than anything, okay. And that was, and one of the reasons is I bought my first copper setup. I just called the Whittiac up, Tim the Whittiac, at the store up in Sturgeon Bay at the time, and I said, Tim, what do you? He's like, why have it spooled up on a 700? Okay, that's what you're spooling up. And he's telling me, I'm like, hey, Tim, do you got one spooled up? He's like, yeah. Send the reel down, spooled up for me so I don't have to do this. So that's how I got my, that was my first 200 foot
until you have to tie your own knot.
Yeah, and then, it's like, okay, I got a tangle. I had to cut it. How do we splice it again? And it's about the most simple thing in the world to do, but you weren't sure. So, hey, why don't you ask him? Well, I think you do it this way. Oh, God, you think? Here goes this complete setup down the drain again.
Wow, that's so interesting. What would you say then at this point with copper? And I'm assuming weighted steel's even newer in the same period, a little after that.
That's probably just the last 3 years.
So that's even
3 to 4 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll sticking with the copper stuff because it's between that and the wire, it's so prevalent. With the copper stuff. How far in after it being kind of introduced to you guys did these techniques start to be implemented with, 3 players off to the side running these elaborate, what period did we really start to see these very elaborate spreads?
I think a lot of that, the guys from Michigan that tournament fished were big into trolling big spreads of lead core and then later the copper. I think they did more of that because they were targeting kings more so than we were. And they would put spoons on all of them and just go cover a lot of water. They'd troll fast.
That was kind of the way like Fuzzy has to fish, So, in that period, you want to know, I think copper showed up about, I want to say about 2002, 2003. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in there. Well, then we had these enormous king years, 5, 4, 5, 6, Right. You didn't have to run it. It was in your way. So you kind of ran one. That's why I say it was a lot of trouble. Well, then as that died off, now, again, we need to have more action. Now you start getting a little more game. And like Mike said, the other guys were already running, so you could pick their brain on how to run it. And the big thing was these board manufacturers were making boards a little different to pull it.
Right. They could actually support it. Right.
That's a good thing now. There's, or the unique thing is there's enough smaller companies to help advance some of this stuff because
to innovate.
Yeah, innovate it and push it along. Like, hey, you need this. Okay, we'll make that. And that's a big thing. That helps us. Now we have a tool to make it work.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you this because I know we're getting pressed for time here and the shop's got to open up. I want to ask each of you, and Rob, of course, if you got something to throw in there, please feel free. He's talked so much this whole time. But for each of you, what was the one thing, or 2 or 3, whatever, what are those couple of things that for you just opened up the door and was just your personal game changers for your fishing over your careers out here on the water? What were those things or 2 that just like, man, wow, without this, I don't think I'd maybe be where I'm at today?
Well, I don't know. I had so many people help me that, with my dad being in the business, that helped me open doors to a lot of people that would help me. But working for Jeff Heinz, he was a highly respected captain in those early days when people didn't know a lot about fishing. He was a highly productive fisherman, and I learned most of what I know from him. And there's just lots of people that have helped me over the years.
Yeah. Couldn't name them all.
Can't name them.
Well, okay. Well, how about if I rephrase it and say maybe it's whether it's a lure or a technique? Let's say, how about that? That really for you was like, oh yeah, this really allowed me to really just expand and,
I can't really pick out a single thing.
Okay.
The thing about fishing is there's so many nuances to it that to me the biggest thing is you have to constantly adapt to today. That's where people get stuck, is they fish how they did a year ago or 10 years ago, and the fishing is constantly evolving, and just what you did that worked so good yesterday, you might be able to go to the same area and there might still be some fish there, but usually they're not. And if they're not there, then you have to, basically my philosophy on the fishing is the way to do it is you systematically eliminate unproductive water. People think, oh, as a charter, you just go to where the fish are. Yeah, well, somebody might have told you there's fish there, but most of the time when you get there, they're gone, and you got to go find some fish. But I always systematically eliminate unproductive water, and sometimes you spend 2 hours doing that, but when you finally find some fish, then you catch them. And then if you have your equipment set up properly, you can catch a lot of fish fast. I had charters where for 3 hours, we had one hit, and then you catch 20 fish in 2 hours. That once you get on them, you got to hustle and do things. But I've had other times where I remember one charter, 8-hour charter, it was like a 40-mile-an-hour west wind. We couldn't go fish out deep because it was just too rough. So the only option we had was troll the shoreline. We'd caught one fish in 5 hours, and then I just tucked in up by the bubbler. There's kind of a little bluff with some trees just south of the bubbler. I just wanted to get out of the wind. That we got in there, we caught like 18 cohos in like 45 minutes, and then we must have caught all that was there, because then I fished it, for 2 more hours and never caught another fish. But I mean, that's how fishing is. That if you get on, you systematically eliminate where they aren't, and then when you finally find them, you got to catch them fast and just load up on them and catch them. But it's just a matter of finding active fish is the biggest thing. That you can't catch fish if there's nothing there.
Right.
That's the biggest thing. And you have to constantly adapt. Every day is different. You can't just do what you did yesterday. You have to always be thinking and interpreting what the day has given you and try and make changes to be successful.
Yeah. Arnie, how about yourself? Is there anything?
I was trying to think. Yeah, boy, it's hard because so many people. Early on, I think one of the things that really clicked, like the technique, was I was telling you about the divers.
Mm-hmm.
When most people were running just one on a side in the summer or two, we were trying to figure out how to run three. And once we got it figured out with mono, because that's all we had, that was something that would really, that was a big number thing. But, again, it's like then we went to wire, and then the guys that didn't want to use wire for a while, and then getting wire, and then running more than one on the side, and then running, hey, these new divers show up, they're big, now let's try to run these right. And it's all those things that keep adding up. I guess they kind of repeat themselves, but in a different manner.
Right.
Now, the biggest, recently the hardest thing I've had is to figure out how to catch fish on meat, on cut bait. Well, now I've kind of figured it out a little bit more. And now I've got confidence, like Mike says, adapting is the biggest thing. I think fishermen's biggest problem is we want to catch fish on what we want to run. And that's the worst thing you can do. You got to catch them on what they want.
What they want,
yeah. But it's such a simple thing, but it's hard to actually do every day. You're like, oh, I've always caught them on this. Yeah, well, then why isn't it working? Well, guess what?
Today's not the day. They want a little
yeah, but you
different.
keep pulling it around.
Yeah.
And you're not, we're supposed to be a little smarter than that, but we're not. We're a creature of habit. This worked. We're going to stay with it. Yeah, no. Let's change it. That's why I say a lot of these guys that come up with these new things, they just come up with an edge of it. But that's because they had the guts to try it because, hey, let's try this. And there's two of them on the boat and they don't care either way. Let's see if this works. And then they come up with, they actually were on the edge of something they didn't realize. And then, they caught it how? And all right, let me try it a little bit. And then a little confidence and then adapt a little more and more confidence. And pretty soon there's no chrome lure Jensen Dodgers out on the lake. They're all plastic. And then that's not enough. The hot spot, I got to have a rotator, and you got to have this rotator, and this one has blue tape. This one has, and now we have this mess that we have.
There's a lot. There's a lot.
I know Rob's happy about that. But he's the only one happy about 900 colors.
One thing that came to mind right now. Where do you guys see going forward? Is, you know, in how would I phrase this? Where do you see, or do you see something as far as a technique or a lure or something? Like, what's the next step? Is there anything that in your mind you see an opportunity in, or do you think, will develop in the next few years? Is there something that comes to mind? Or is this just going to be what we're doing now? You know, the cores, the coppers.
I got nothing. You just go along for the ride. Yeah. You know, you figure it out as you go. That, like I said, every day is a new day on the water, and the fishing is constantly changing. That it just is all, you have to constantly adapt to the conditions you have right now today.
Yeah.
That's
which, and because you said that, that's what made me think about. You know, I wonder if someone's out there, or who's going to drop, I don't know, whatever kind of line, or, you know, whatever comes out as a new lure or something. It's interesting to see where it's going to go.
Think about all the crazy things people have tried.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I was thinking about it, there was at one time this gizmo you'd put on your downrigger and hook your line to it. And it would actually, as you were trolling around, reel up the distance of line, get to a certain point, and then let it go back. So you'd have this like constant changing lure speed thing. And I remember looking at it and thinking, come on, really? What happens if it would have worked?
I brought it. I have it in my car.
I should have there you go. Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of stuff, though, you don't think, why would you put a diver on wire? Are you kidding me? No way. That's not going to work. Guess what?
You talk about strange things. Back in the 70s, mid-70s, Denny Boggs was a captain out of Waukegan. And as yellowbirds first became available, nobody was running lead cores or copper or anything like that, because lead core was available, but nobody was running it at that time. He actually made his own boards out of big blocks of styrofoam with a wood frame. They were about 3 feet long with a huge block of styrofoam, and he mounted a hand crank Riviera downrigger, and he would lift the thing up on the side of his boat, lower the downrigger down 90 feet, with a rod in it, and then he would feed it out on a rope. It was like a giant yellowbird with a downrigger mounted on it. He called them Herman and Gertrude. He ran one on each side. And in the summer, when we couldn't, we could only get our 4 downriggers down deep, he had 6 downriggers down deep. And they were out to the sides, so they had all the benefit of a lead core or copper. They're out to the sides where the fish aren't spooking from the boat going by. And they were awkward as all get out to use. But he would catch half his fish on those 2 lines compared to the other half would come on his regular lines, how normal people fished. But he would put up with it, because he would just, in the summertime, he would just pound the fish. But you talk about innovating. He's got a hand crank Riviera on a giant styrofoam block that he made into a giant planer board on a rope, and it would take 2 grown men to pull it in, because there was no tripping. You had to just wrestle it in. But
that is
he
dedication.
Caught a lot of fish.
That is dedication.
People are always thinking of better ways to do things.
My Lord.
Yeah.
Robin.
Imagine that.
Now we have copper and lead core. It's a lot easier.
Imagine. I don't know where the giant thing, where would you put it in the store? It'd take like a whole wall of. Oh yeah, those things were.
And storing it on your boat, and everything about it was awkward, but it worked.
Jeez.
That's it's funny you said Riviera downrigger.
They were the biggest name in downriggers in those days.
I bet you most of the people listening don't even know what it is.
As soon as electric downriggers came out, it killed them. Yeah. They were the king of manual downriggers.
Yep. And that was a West Coast company, wasn't it, Mike?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. Rob, got anything wrong?
No, I think we got it pretty well covered. I just keep thinking about that downrigger mounted onto a planer board. And what a mess that would be if it got snagged.
He had a rope on it, so it really wasn't a problem. If you tangle with somebody else's yellowbird, you won.
Or you definitely have the boat. You'd be able to not have to worry about a pilot. You just go in a nice circle until you got the thing freed up.
Jeez, you know that. Wow, I don't know about you. I'm just. It was so interesting to hear so much of kind of going through a timeline. Now, granted, for people listening, I know we didn't cover like every little thing because this could be this could be hours. And honestly, I absolutely would love to have you guys back. I'm pretty sure Rob agrees to do a continuation, and I'm pretty sure maybe this episode will get questions people want to dive deeper in, and maybe that could be kind of like the starting point for a continuation of this. But I think it's really cool to kind of start getting an idea for so many people that are using these tackle and techniques right now that don't know where they came about, and kind of getting just a general idea of kind of where they came up from and what was the thinking, what was happening on the lake at this time that led to so much of these changes in techniques and lures. And you guys sharing the stories was really for me I was looking forward to this. It was really, really cool. And I know you guys are filled up with a lot more that we'll have to come back for a continuation on this. So thank you both for coming and joining us here for the Lake Michigan Angler podcast. Is there anything finally you wanted to share with the folks? Because obviously we're going to have all their guys' info. If you guys want to get on the trip with them, fantastic fishermen and charters. So we'll link to them below so you guys can reach out and hopefully coming in the spring, you guys can reach out and get on some coho early and do that. But any final thoughts, guys, you want to share?
Just that fishermen nowadays don't realize how good they have it because they haven't seen the progression that we've seen, that the multitude of lures and techniques, that somebody figured it all out. At some point in time, that to me, it's just mind-boggling what's available to you now compared to where we started.
Yeah, especially when you first started with the rod descriptions, like, oh my God.
Yeah, there were no salmon-specific rods. You used striper rods from casting off the beach in the ocean.
Like surf rods?
Most people use surf rods. Is what people used.
Rough.
The one thing I think, like Mike was saying, with other people, that's the one thing you run into now. I mean, you always had it. So many people that think they're the cutting edge of everything. And it's like, there's so many guys, and most of them aren't with us anymore, that were, in this area especially, tool and die guys, guys that worked in, fabricating that, they had a mind for a little bit of development, and they were the ones that pushed it along. There's several people that I knew, I was lucky enough to know. But like guys like Joe Duffin and Howie, and I mean that the impact that they had, they didn't realize that they were just doing it because this was a new thing, and this was the new thing in the country, and was Lake Michigan, and it blew up, and these guys were there, and we're lucky that they were. I would hate to be fishing with pink ladies still.
You might want to break them out. I was just thinking about this. Maybe it's worth on one of those slow days, you break out the old stuff and just see how it fishes today. That's actually, obviously maybe on a work day, but it's an interesting thought to do that, to test out, how those lures stand up to today's water. I
drag some out once in a while. I'm not putting the pink lady back in the water.
I would not run a pink lady.
We're all done with that one. We don't know what would happen at the wrong species. It might go in a circle on me and grab everything. But yeah.
Years ago, I don't remember when it was. It was before there were Dipsy divers. Actually, it was when the Dipsy diver first came out. I remember trying a deep 6 because the Dipsy would only get down so deep before we were running it on wire. And I did pull out a deep 6 and try and run it, figuring, when the fish were down 90 feet, you need to get down there. But that was before, Dipsies had big rings on them, and before we ran them on wire, and before there was Power Pro and stuff like that. But I tried it one day, and I'm like, I'm not doing this again. I'll just go without the fish.
Yeah.
Definitely speaks to how you said it. Guys got it easy these days, and you have to go back to all that extra hard work. Well, guys, thank you again for joining us. Let us know how you guys enjoyed this episode, kind of like a history of the techniques and like the innovation on Lake Michigan with fishing. Let us know below how you enjoyed it. Any questions you may have, because we might have to do a follow up to this. So I believe we're probably going to get questions, because there's stuff that obviously in the conversation people might have thought about that. But say, hey, you should ask them about this and that. And so we would love for you guys to leave that feedback with us, so we can compile that, and Rob and I can get together and bug these guys to come back in a future episode. So. Really cool, man.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.